Hey, we're going to get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ariana Karakis, Senior Assistant for Exhibitions and Programming at the Edith Farnsworth House, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first winter webinar of 2025 entitled Antecedents and Descendants, the Edith Farnsworth House and its Influences. We're joined today by Professor Deitrich Neumann, and unfortunately, Michelangelo Sabatino, who was in conversation with him, is no longer able to join us, but I will still introduce both of them in a moment. For a brief bit of housekeeping on this event, this is the 7th year we've offered this series, and for the presentations, to make it easier for technological lack of mishaps, we've taken to recording the talks, but the speakers will join us for a live Q&A at the end of the presentation. Secondly, if you haven't already registered for our February 16th or March 16th webinars, we hope you'll do so, as it's planned as a 3-part series related to nature and culture, our 2024 and 2025 interpretive theme, which includes exhibitions, programs, events, and special tours. Please check out our website for the latest information. Thirdly, I hope you'll join us on site on Sunday afternoon, March 30th, as we celebrate the opening of Movement, Water into Wood, The Art of Truman Lowe, our first exhibition of 2025. The late Ho-Chunk artist Truman Lowe will be featured in a major retrospective at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian later this year, and we're really excited to have him beforehand. We're also partnering with the Shingothi Center of Aurora University on a summer exhibition of Potawatomi ash baskets. So again, check our website for updates in the coming months. Our speakers today are familiar names to the Misesian scholars and Farnsworth fans. Deitrich has contributed a fascinating chapter to Michelangelo's 2024 book, The Edith Farnsworth House, Architecture, Preservation, Culture. And Deitrich's recently published Mies van der Rohe, An Architect in His Time, contains several pages dedicated to the Edith Farnsworth House. Deitrich Neumann is a professor of history of modern architecture and urban studies at Brown University and is known for his focus on the architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. He has held fellowships at the Canadian Center for Architecture and at Princeton University, has been a visiting professor at Yale University, and will be speaking in Chicago in a few months, housed by the Mies van der Rohe Society. Michelangelo Sabatino, who unfortunately cannot join us today, is a professor of architectural history and heritage at the College of Architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology, where he currently directs the PhD program in architecture, and it is the inaugural John Vinci Distinguished Research Fellow. In addition to the aforementioned Farnsworth House history, he's recently published Mies in His Own Words, Complete Writings, Speeches in Interval, 1922 to 1969, co-edited with Vittorio Pindazzi. After the presentation, they will have some points between the two of them in terms of conversation, and then you all can drop your comments or questions in the chat, and Professor Neumann will get to them after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Reminder to keep yourselves muted during the presentation.
Greetings, everyone. Professor Neumann from Brown and myself are going to discuss the Edith Farnsworth House today. We're part of a small group of scholars that have been exploring the contributions of Mies, and you will find out more about Deitrich's contributions. But for this particular session, we are going to focus on this new book that you may have all seen, to which Professor Neumann contributed an important essay on the Farnsworth House and its precedents. And so I will now hand over the baton to him, and he will illuminate you on the house itself, and then we will follow with Q&A. I will ask him a number of questions for about 10-15 minutes, and then we will also hand over questions to our viewers. Thank you very much, and the baton to you, sir.
Thank you, Michelangelo. I'd like to begin by thanking Scott Mehaffey, the director of the Farnsworth House, and Professor Sabatino for inviting me to talk for a little bit about my own take on the Farnsworth House and Mises' work surrounding and preceding it. And to do that, I will share my screen and show you a few images that I have prepared. And of course, as you already heard, Professor Sabatino, together with Vittorio Pizzigoni, just published a book on Mies in his own words, complete writings, speeches, and interviews. And Michelangelo by himself published, edited this big volume on the Edith Farnsworth House, celebrating 20 years of the moment when it was acquired by the National Trust. And so I join this with my own book that you see here on the right, Mies van der Rohe, an architect in his time, that just came out with Yale University Press, which is a biography and overview of Mies's entire career, both the German and the American part, and tries to contribute a few new findings and a few new ideas to our understanding of Mies, and tries also to bring in the perspective of someone who was trained as an architect, myself, and be perhaps somewhat less hagiographic than its predecessor. So I look forward to sharing a few images with you and then talking with Michelangelo afterwards. Just as I mentioned, perhaps very quick overview of Mies's career. Not everyone is, of course, entirely familiar with Mies, and I wanted to begin perhaps in tribute to Michelangelo's book on Mies's writings and the book on the Farnsworth House with quotes by Mies, with two quotes that I like particularly. It's not the famous quotes that he is well known for, such as "less is more," and I'm not even sure if he ever said that, quite frankly. I think it might have been Philip Johnson, or "God is in the details," or "I don't want to be interesting, I want to be good." It's none of those. I want to share two quotes with you, which I think are really pertinent to what we are going to talk about today. The first one is something that he said in a conversation with Christian Norbeck Schulz in about 1958. And I always tell my students at Brown University that this is perhaps the most important thing, is very short, that he ever said. And he said, "Architecture begins when we put two bricks carefully together." I love this quote because it obviously encompasses the essentialism that was so important to him, bringing a large field to an essential statement. It's about craft, it's about modular architecture, it's about attention to detail. And all of this is, of course, significant for Mies, in particular his later work, and in particular the Farnsworth House. So that's quote number one, and you'll probably be reminded of it as I go through the details of my little presentation today. The second quote is something that he said, or rather wrote down, in 1933. It wasn't published at the time. It was in a brochure for the glass industry. And the year is, of course, significant because it's the year when his work essentially stops in Germany. It's the year when the Nazis take over, and they have absolutely no taste for his kind of architecture, as many of you know. And Mies embarks, or rather suffers through, an entire decade of not getting anything done. It's the most unproductive decade of his life, from 1933 to 43, when he finally builds the first building on the IIT campus. And here's the year 33, when he's sort of taking stock of what is most important for him. And he says, which I think, imagine the Farnsworth House while I read this, is really quite pertinent. He says, "Now it becomes clear again what a wall is, what an opening, what is floor, and what's ceiling. Simplicity of construction, clarity of tectonic means, and purity of material reflect the luminosity of original beauty. Only now can we articulate space, open it up, and connect it to the landscape, thereby filling the spatial needs of modern man." So I'll jump right in now. Just for those of you who don't know Mies's entire career, I'll just give you 2 minutes of an overview. I think the great Renaissance architect and writer Giorgio Vasari would have liked Mies's career. It has that beautiful arc of first half in Germany with great success already and international fame. Then there is a full decade of rather desperate looking for work. The Nazis come, he flees or leaves Germany, ends up in Chicago without speaking English, becomes the director of the IIT Architecture School, and then finally enjoys a second brilliant half of his career. So in the first half, where he is mostly in Berlin, he was born in Aachen. He has sort of amazing a sort of switch to the avant-garde with buildings like the skyscraper Berlin Friedrichstraße, the concrete office building, both of them just visionary projects drawn in enormous size on huge pieces of brown packing paper. And then, of course, the realized fantastic building of the German pavilion at the Barcelona World's Fair, the most discussed building of modern building of its time, I think. And the Tugendhat house, we'll get to to both of these buildings in a moment. Again, in Brno, where he can realize these ideas that were a little more sort of detached from reality at this exhibition pavilion, now applied to a real home for a wealthy industrialist. And then he comes to America in 37, 38, and finally from 43 onwards, as second half of his career, buildings on IIT's campus, the Farnsworth house that I'll come back to in a moment, and the Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, and of course the architecture school, Crown Hall at IIT, and finally the Seagram building in New York. All of these, in a way, setting paradigms, establishing paradigms for building types of the office building, of the apartment house, of the school. And then finally, he returns to Berlin with a triumphant final building, the new National Gallery. In 1968, he sees the roof going up as he visits, but he is not there for the opening of the gallery, but it's, of course, a triumphant final work. So really quite interesting, and something that I've never been able to fully explain is the transition that Mies makes from this series of somewhat conventional, very well executed, but certainly conventional houses in Berlin and its suburbs or a neighboring town of Potsdam. Very conventional. They wouldn't really stand out among buildings of that type that are being built in the years before, during, and then briefly after the First World War. Nothing can really explain the radical shift in 1922 when this drawing is being made and exhibited and establishes Mies as a member of the avant-garde. So it's the skyscraper at the Friedrichstraße railroad station of 1922 and a sort of version of it, the Curvilinia skyscraper, done more or less at the same time on a smaller footprint with this wonderful curved glass facade. Very radical and much published at the time. Mies discovers at that moment not just a whole new approach to architecture for himself, but also the importance of getting his work published. And he sends out these drawings and photo montages with them, et cetera, to many magazines, and that eagerly pick those up. And then in 1927, we see him experiment on behalf of the glass industry that commissions him to do an exhibition pavilion at the Werkbund exhibition in 1927, something that tries out how glass could be used in a domestic environment. And you see him here, something that's similar to what he had already suggested in this glass skyscraper. I just showed you the outside walls, the area between floor and ceiling consisting of nothing but glass panes, a radical new approach, no more windows, just the absence of walls, very similar to what he had described in the quote that I started with. And this exhibition space is short-lived, but makes a big impression on the audience and on his colleagues. And then he gets commissioned to design this German pavilion at the World's Fair in Barcelona, where he not only pursues this sort of essentialism of building elements, cladding them, however, in very precious materials because obviously it was a representative building, but he also embraces the spatial openness and connectedness of different areas of the interior. All of these, of course, are elements that in the end would determine the Farnsworth House's aesthetics and philosophy as well. So here's the interior, and you see how there are no closed spaces, but rather there's a continuous visual flow from the inside, from the outside to the inside. The reflections of those polished marble walls, of course, enhance that spatial fluidity. And then you see a little pool with a statue that you only sort of recognize here, somewhat fractured in reflections, and a continuous spatial flow. This is something that critics, of course, noticed. And the building initially existed only for 8 months, and then thanks to the photographer Sasha Stone in a series of 13 brilliant black and white photographs of the type that you just saw, and then for Mies's 100th birthday, the building is rebuilt and now lets us, in fact, test the descriptions of contemporaries of what it really meant and how it was perceived and experienced. And I want to just give you a few images and one example of a really quite prominent critic, a man called Walter Rietzler, who wrote, "The way in which the different rooms, entirely without firm boundaries, flow into each other, and the entire building opens itself up towards the outside, is without parallel in the entire field of architecture. The pavilion was based on spatial flow and spatial fusion, and thus on a temporal process, even independently from a viewer's experience. In short, four-dimensional space moving with time," Walter Rietzler writes in 1933. The reference to four-dimensional space moving with time is, of course, a reference to Albert Einstein and his space-time continuum, somewhat misunderstood and simplified here, but the feeling was among many critics that the Barcelona pavilion's modernity could be understood and explained by this parallel with Einstein's space-time continuum, and thus made it sort of relevant and a real expression of its time. Everyone was thinking and talking about Einstein. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1922, and so people had become familiar to a certain degree. It's very hard for the average citizen to understand what the space-time continuum really consists of in the fourth dimension, but those terms were in the air and were now applied to this building. But this sort of modernity, being of its time, is of course something that Mies was very keen on. And almost parallel, in fact, is the application of these spatial ideas to a residential project, the Tugendhat House for wealthy textile industrialists in the city of Brno, in the newly founded Czechoslovakia after the First World War. And you see here the same idea of having a glass wall surrounding two, almost three sides of the living room, and really reaching from floor to ceiling. Two of those windows could be lowered into the ground. And I put in this photograph out of two reasons here. I took it last summer, the one on the right, is to demonstrate two things. One is that Mies actually did something about the sun hitting the south-facing glass facade, which would heat up in the summer. And of course, the Farnsworth House would encounter similar problems. And so there's this sort of movable marquise that's coming down, designed by Mies. And the other point I want to make is that the historic photo on the left shows at the bottom here plants that are put there and were in fact meant to grow and cover the whole sort of basement floor. And for the longest time, because we all had this sort of imagery of modern architecture as being white and cubic and unspoiled by nature in a way, these had not been restored after the building was restored to its original beauty. But now, in fact, these growing plants have been nourished and cover the ground floor of the building, which I think is really an interesting aspect for Mies's relationship with nature. And I'll just quickly show you two more images that I took recently, where you show how he responds to the impact of sunlight, and then a quick look at the interior. Many of you are familiar with it. And of course, this sort of integration of nature via this sort of sliver of a greenhouse on the side, and then through the opening towards the garden with this magnificent view over the city is very, very important. And here already you see certain similarities to the Farnsworth house. And so these ideas, in fact, are very important in the sort of evolution of Mies's style. And I feel in some ways the Farnsworth house brings a lot of them together into this new and very important paradigm. I want to just show you how his sketches of unexecuted buildings in the following years, where he couldn't get anything built due to the political situation, reflect both the Farnsworth house, the Barcelona pavilion, and to a certain degree perhaps also the Tugendhat house, but mostly the Barcelona pavilion and the photographs that had been made of it. And you see here very clear those glass walls for a house in Magdeburg with a courtyard and that comparable relationship to the landscape. So in the floor plan, the upper half here, if you can see my arrow going around, this is a glass wall that is surrounding the living room. And so there's a seating area. Here's a piano, obviously a fireplace, and then a dining area. You see 4 columns in this space, but the roof protrudes from these columns as a cantilever, and then you have thin glass walls and mullions in all likelihood. So it's a very similar idea. And here's another view of that Huber house showing part of this glass enclosed interior. So these ideas are there, and then lead, of course, to the Farnsworth house's students at the Bauhaus, where Mies was director from 1930 to 1933. Very much imitated his ideas and his style. He was a sort of very influential teacher in a way that the students picked up his ideas, and he didn't seem to have supported other approaches to architecture in his studios. This one is interesting just as a quick note here. When you look at the columns, you can just see that they are these same kind of cruciform columns that he employed in the Barcelona pavilion and the Tugendhat house. What Mies probably would have not liked here, that his student at the Bauhaus, Siegfried Bormann, in fact, put one of those columns on the outside, as you can see here, and one on the inside. I don't think that would have passed Mies's critique. It's obviously not quite logical to do it like this. And so just want to point this out. This obviously immediately reminds us of the Farnsworth house, and the students just put Mies's Barcelona chairs in there and basically followed his design ideas. But now, just one sketch that Mies did in that year, 1933, when he wrote that wonderful quote about the essentialism that he was after, where he imagined a house in the mountains that is suspended on some sort of hillside, suspended in the air. There's room enough for a parking car, and otherwise you seem to have a glass box in the center with the diagonal struts and maybe a sort of screened-in area at the end. Then when Mies comes to the United States, he continues very similar teaching methods and ideas. His students at IIT, whom you see here, also had to design these courtyard houses that all followed the Barcelona pavilion. And another project that he did in 1931, the house at the building exhibition in Berlin, and then ideas of the Tugendhat house, and many of his unexecuted projects come to pass. So his pedagogy doesn't really change very much from the Bauhaus to IIT in terms of the tasks that he gives his students to solve. So here's Mrs. Farnsworth, who became a really important partner and sponsor in Mies's quest for a house in which all of these ideas came together, a sort of fluid spatial connection between different living areas, a very simple essentialist structure consisting just of, floor and ceiling plate columns and no windows, but rather absence of outside walls, which have been replaced by glass. So really building a home reduced to its essence. And so wanted to quickly show you these two sketches. My friend Hassan Bagheri helped me with them. We know from descriptions by Edward Duckett, who did this drawing for me, that there were two versions. One where the Farnsworth house sits on the ground, and one where it is elevated above from the ground. And of course, Mies liked this version much better. And then he came in with Mrs. Farnsworth to look at them. And according to Edward Duckett, he then hand colored it with watercolors, and this drawing, which we still have. The other one doesn't exist anymore. And what I showed you was just a sort of rendering by Hassan Bagheri. This drawing finally gets done and is in 1945 already basically the recipe for the house. It didn't change all that much, as you can see here, maybe with one small exception. You can, if you look very closely, see that Mies had planned for a screened-in porch because there are lots of mosquitoes next to the river. And that's also what you saw in the model in the MoMA exhibition in 1947. Then the porch isn't established yet when photographers come and take photos of the house. And these images are so compelling that it doesn't get re-photographed with the porch, with the screened-in porch in place. Mrs. Farnsworth, of course, had the screen put in the end because she needed protection from the mosquitoes. But Lord Palumbo, once he bought the house, took it out again because the building looks just so much better without the screened-in porch. But I wanted to just quickly talk a little bit about a few aspects of, on the one hand side, a culmination of ideas that Mies had since 1922, the glass wrapped space, but also new approaches and new ideas. And one thing that really changes from both his own designs in Germany and that of his students was the role of structure. And the columns in Barcelona and at the Tugendhat house in those drawings by his students, of course, were ephemeral, almost invisible. They were in Brno in Barcelona covered in highly reflective nickel, later chromium, so they were almost invisible. Here now the columns are over-dimensioned rolled steel columns that very clearly play an important role, 4 of them on either side. And the building is lifted up from the ground, which is, of course, so much more elegant than the building I showed you sitting flat on the ground. The official reason why Mies chose this position, or this solution rather, was that he was, of course, looking at a floodplain, and the Fox River would occasionally rise, and therefore the building needed to be lifted up from the ground. The other option would, of course, have been to put it further up. Here's a sort of hill in the back where the building could have also been located and would have been protected better from the flood, but then there would have been no reason to lift it up from the ground. So I think Mies was sort of driven by the sort of formal beauty of a building hovering above ground when he made his decision. Back to the structure, what you see here, those wide rolled steel beams are sort of the industrial I-beams that are used in every skyscraper. They are over-dimensioned, as critics already noticed at the time. They could have been slimmer for the weight that they carry, but they are really interesting in the way they connect to those metal bands that hold the terrace and hold the roof and the floor. You see here what we call an I-beam seen from above. And Architectural Forum already wrote, the glass house seems suspended as if by magnetic force. And indeed, we can't really see how are these I-beams connected to the metal band that they carry that holds the whole terrace and the whole house. That is invisible. And that is really quite interesting. I want to show you here just quickly how these I-beams, in fact, are produced. They're rolled in the factory, pressed under heat, and then finally brought into their final form. Looks like this hot, glowing orange iron that rolls back and forth while those drums tighten and tighten and finally end up with an I-beam. So it's really primal force at work in a highly industrial environment, quite different from the idyllic environment in which they are then placed in the landscape. And here's a drawing that Michelangelo found at MoMA, which shows what Mies is doing here, which is quite interesting and sort of rarely discussed, but I think it's very, very important. Mies employs a fairly young technique. And you see here that you can't see any welding seams, or you can't see any screws or nuts and bolts. And that technique, this is what you normally would expect to see when two pieces of steel come together. Either it's bolted and screwed together, or it's welded. You see here, down here, the welding seams at the corners. And the solution is the so-called plug weld, fairly recent invention at the time, very difficult to do, where you have holes on one side, and then you bring in your welding torch and additional melted steel, and basically glue within this hole the lower part, in this case, so the attached, the adjacent steel, glue it together with one above with the help of that plug. And that is exactly what happened. It's very complicated to do that. If we look at one of the very few construction photos, you'll see that the invisible parts here, these down here, they of course have screws and bolts. That was just the normal way to do it and the easiest. But the visible parts have these plug welds. Really very complex to do, because it meant you had to bring in welding equipment and sort of fix these adjacent parts in place, and then first weld it together with a blowtorch, with a torch, and then grind it down, smooth it over, polish it, and then it would get painted over 3 layers of white paint. If you look very carefully in some of those, you can actually see traces of those plug welds, slight unevenness in the surface here, barely visible. This is the remnant of the plug weld here. And, you know, it's a hard to get to point. So Mies went to enormous length to establish those plug welds and to make the building look as magically put together as he did. Here's one last image of them being put together. The problem is it's quite complicated. The sort of literature says plug welds are not suitable for the transfer of high forces, and are especially not suitable for dynamically loaded connections. The connection is formed by the weld on walls of circular oval openings and in the contact surface of the adjoining part. Plugs of small dimensions are usually fully filled with a weld. Here's that is here the case. These welds are not suitable for the joining of thicker plates and are usually used for thinner plates up to approximately 15 millimeter thick, which is just the limit that he reaches here. And these connections are very hard to calculate, because it all depends on the skill of whoever is holding the welding tool here, and how deeply he connects it to the adjacent steel beam. So it's a very sort of precarious, but also quite beautiful method, which involves a lot of labor and hand craft at the end, in great contrast to this industrial piece of metal. When Philip Johnson came to visit, he wrote, Mies wasn't there because he had had a falling out at the court case with Mrs. Farnsworth over the escalating costs of the house. Philip Johnson wrote to Mies, "The steel connections are so inevitable, so clean, so beautifully executed, that I believe no one will ever improve on them. Their problems are solved once and for all. Their execution is also a wonder to me. I'm amazed that you found workmen to execute them so well. I cannot be specific because each one is as good as the next. It exhausts me to even imagine what work you have been through," he wrote. And it's very important to understand that Mies here pursued something quite different from structural honesty, right? It's the opposite. We have no idea how that structure works unless we have very specific knowledge. It's more of a structural poetry, a sort of magic that he works here, really quite wonderful. Unfortunately, this kind of orientation to detail and to perhaps less is more, if you like, but the attention to detail didn't necessarily apply to all parts of the house. There, you know, as we know from the famous court case between them, there were all kinds of problems with the house as Mrs. Farnsworth moved in. There was no protection from sunlight, so it got very hot. It was cold in the winter. There was no air conditioning. Lord Colombo, when he bought it, put in air conditioning, so now it's much easier to inhabit it. Obviously, there was no mosquito protection inside the house. In the front, there was this sort of screened porch, which thank God is not there anymore. The roof started leaking after the first winter. The heating created sort of a layer of soot in the whole building. And the fireplace that you see on the right did not draw air as the house was sealed. So it only worked when the door was open, which in the winter, of course, is somewhat counterproductive. And of course, as we know, the house, despite its elevated position, suffered from regular flooding. So there were all kinds of issues that Mies did not put attention to, but other, in particular, those structural connections, he was very, very interested in. I want to just very quickly show you how, in fact, both the sort of beauty and benefits of what Mies had worked out here, this sort of application of artistic intentionality and design ingenuity to the structural problems at the cost, perhaps, of some of the livability and qualities of the house were replicated elsewhere. Here's the Algonquin apartment project on the left, developed while he was working with Mrs. Farnsworth. He also tried to have floor-to-ceiling windows here, and at least some of the rooms, but they were very hard to sell to the developer. He finally managed to get permission to do that in the wonderful Lakeshore Drive apartments. And only after he had taken the developer to a restaurant, which also had floor-to-ceiling windows, the tip-top bar at the Ellerton Hotel in Chicago, and they realized that, in fact, one could live in a place that had windows and some rather steep views outside of them. I should also mention that in Mies's apartment here on the second floor, there was also one corner window that had almost floor-to-ceiling windows, so he was used to that view. And here, of course, is a closer facade view to this very, very elegant Lakeshore Drive apartment building. And when we look a little closer, we'll see that he applies something very similar to what he did at the Farnsworth house. In this case, in a way, a representation of a smaller I-beam attached to the facade, also no welding seams visible, as a representation of the actual load-bearing structure, which had to remain invisible because of fire protection. But the building also had no air conditioning and had certain shortcomings. And I found this wonderful quote from Peter Blake, who was a friend of Mies's, also a German immigrant, originally called Peter Blach from Berlin. And he wrote in Architecture Forum a very interesting quote, which I wanted to read to you because it sort of brings together some sort of crucial element of Mies's approach. He says, in Mies's arsenal of architectural solutions, there's one large and as yet unclosed gap. To many critics, it has seemed that Mies is being eloquent about the steel cage at the expense of making the space within that cage work properly in terms of mechanical equipment and indoor climate. Very similar to Farnsworth. Mies has tried to answer his critics by saying brusquely that this is not my specialty. Yet to most laymen, these problems are certainly part of the architect's responsibility. Unprotected glass walls may be exquisitely beautiful, but exquisite beauty has a way of being elusive when the glass walls are backed up by improvised brown paper shades scotch taped to the insides by sizzling and blinded humanity. Perhaps technology will again come to the rescue in the end, which it did, of course, but that end is not yet in sight. For the present, at least, the architect must be the one to come to the rescue. So really interesting response. And that brings me back to the Farnsworth house, where while this court case between Mies and Mrs. Farnsworth was lingering 4 years in the courts, there was sort of a bit of a sort of battle for public opinion between Elizabeth Gordon, editor of House Beautiful, who was on the side of Mrs. Farnsworth and fiercely opposed to modern architecture, and of course Mies and his defenders on the other side. They all published a number of essays to influence the decision-making in the courts. So she writes, international style architects are much more concerned with the exterior than with what happens inside the house. They are more interested in the facade of the house than in how it works for the inhabitants. The highest accolade they give an object is that it looks like a Mondrian. The fascination with form, without regard to function, continues today in the work of international style architects like Mies van der Rohe, she said. She also called him a threat to the next America, whatever that means. But she continues on saying that the international style architecture is perhaps the most unlivable type of home for man since he descended from the tree and entered a cave in the much touted all-glass cube of international style. You burn up in the summer, freeze in the winter, because nothing must interfere with the pure form of their rectangles. No overhanging roofs to shade you from the sun, the bare minimum of gadgets and possessions so as not to spoil the clean look. 3 or 4 pieces of furniture placed along arbitrary preordained lines, room for only few books and one painting at precise and prominent points, no children, no dogs, extremely meager kitchen facilities, nothing human might disturb the architect's composition, she writes. Really, really interesting points to be made. And of course, she promoted a different kind of modern architecture, one that was cozy and had natural elements and materials, etc., in her series of pace-set houses that she published in House Beautiful. So these are interesting points in the debate. And Mrs. Farnsworth, of course, in her memoirs, in fact, remembered how her visitors had sort of absorbed the sort of positive reviews in the magazines when they came to visit her and basically adopted them without being able to form their own opinion. She said the big glossy reviews polished up their terms and phrases with such patience that the simpler minds that came to have a look expected to find the glass box light enough to stay afloat in air or water, moored to its columns and enclosing its mystic space. So culture spreads by proclamation. She quoted Mies here. And one got the impression that if the house had had the form of a banana rampant instead of a rectangle couchon, the proclamation would have been just as imperative. So it's all about the looks in a way these critics and Mrs. Farnsworth themselves seem to suggest, which is of course something that Heidegger already noticed, that the fundamental event of the modern age is the conquest of the world as an image. And Michel de Certeau echoed that in 1984 when he said, from television to newspapers, from advertising to all sorts of mercantile epiphanies, our society is characterized by a cancerous growth of vision which measures everything by its ability to show or be shown. So to come to an end, the point I'm trying to make here is that Mies was very concerned with the appearance, the photogeneity of the house, the magic of those structural connections, but he considered architecture almost as an independent art form here, with less concern for the working mechanics inside and the lives of the inhabitant. And this is, of course, something that I think is worth discussing. What is it? What qualities of architecture are we, in fact, using to understand if a building is good, is worth being part of the canon? Which qualities are the ones that count? The photogeneity, that is clearly the case here, or the architectural qualities of providing comfort and shelter and working well. I leave this for our discussion. I want to end with this wonderful quote, image by one last look, of course, at the interior, and then this wonderful image by Hiroshi Sugimoto that suggests that our knowledge and our approach to the Farnsworth House is still in flux and somewhat foggy and not crystal clear, I hope, and constantly being developed further. I'll end on this note and thank you for your attention, and I will ask Professor Sabatino to come back on for our discussion.
Thank you, Deitrich, for this wonderful lecture. And I learned, if that's possible, I learned even more. And it's always the building and the site needs so much unpacking that one learns all the time. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So let us jump into some questions, trying to be mindful of our time. And I wonder if you can discuss the German term Landhaus, written that Mies wrote like under the brick country house drawing that you published in the essay in my book. Landhaus being roughly the equivalent of Italian villa, and secondly, how does the Edith Farnsworth house fit into the long tradition of modern country houses in Europe and in North America, or the Americas in general?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, Landhaus, yes, is something like a house in the country, but suggestive of a large house, a villa. I'm in my sort of understanding of the Farnsworth house, I think it's more equivalent to a cabin in the woods, a sort of simple weekend house, a one-room house, just like, you know, a sort of log cabin that Mies actually stayed in 1938 on his vacation somewhere up in Wisconsin, I think. So it's something of that type, and as such, I think there are parallels to a primitive hut, to Adam's house in Paradise. If Mies had been Jewish, which he wasn't, but the Nazis suspected he might have been Jewish, one could think of a sukkah, you know, it's a very simple structure. So I think it fits more into this genealogy than in the grand country house that, as you mentioned, of course, has a long tradition in Europe. That's a different thing altogether, I think.
Okay, thank you. And you know, to build on the land of Landhaus, you know, Mies's connection to the land evolves over time, especially as he moves from the, as you described them, the conventional houses that he built in Berlin, Potsdam, that were typically two-story, and then he gradually moves to one-story freestanding pavilions. For example, Barcelona, the Lemke House, the Rieser, and the Farnsworth to some extent. So my question to you is, like, with the exception during the 30s of the Tugendhat or the Krefeld villas, he seems to embrace the one-story over the two-story moving forward. What do you think are the spatial differences of this change?
Yeah, that's another very good question. I think the Mies seems to have been sort of thinking mostly in two-dimension, in continuity as you sort of walk through spaces rather than in a expansion in the third dimension going up. The Rieser house that you mentioned is really an interesting case, that unexecuted project of 1937 and the following years over a river in Montana, no, in Wyoming rather, right? The interesting thing is when he designs it over this river, it has 2 floors on either side and then a one-story bridge over this river. And then the project falls apart and nothing happens. But he shows a reduced version of it, which looks like a sibling to the Farnsworth house in the 1947 exhibition, where he reduced the Rieser house to just 1 floor. And in his model, that 1 floor sits right over the water surface of that river there, which of course would have meant once again it would have been flooded at the next thawing ice coming down in the spring, and shows it in a way as sort of an equivalent to the Farnsworth house. But you're absolutely right that his sort of preference seems to have been for a horizontal sort of pedestrian experience as you move from space to space rather than elevations. That I think is something he was sort of perhaps less interested in, this sort of movement from floor to floor as a spatial experience. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Right. Okay, and so apropos, you know, the land and what might be precedents to Mies's own work. As you know, many scholars have, you know, written about Mies's interest in Carl Friedrich Schinkel in Berlin, his work, and to better understand perhaps Mies's inclination towards the classical or also his engagement with nature and landscape. But in your essay in my book, you don't mention Schinkel. Now, is this because you think the connection has been somewhat overemphasized or is wrong altogether?
I think it has been overemphasized. In my own book, I have a quote where he sort of remembers his time working in The Hague on his Kröller-Müller design, which was never executed. It's 1912, and so it's a big country house for a wealthy industrialist, a real Landhaus in that respect. He says, I had to really get through a struggle and move away from Schinkel quite consciously at that moment. So he talks about moving away from Schinkel, and I think in his work, in his modernist work, he doesn't have that much in common with Schinkel. I see that parallel has been drawn very often, but I think the common denominator with Schinkel is so broad and so sort of simplistic that, you know, that would connect him to pretty much any architect who came before him. I think there isn't really that much there that makes him either a classicist or a sort of romantic architect. I think his interest was just elsewhere. It was in materials and technology and finding amazing solutions to corners and stuff like that. That was what excited him rather than the sort of more ephemeral relationship to the landscape.
Right. And maybe this is a question that just come to mind as as you responded. You know, clearly there's an army of folks, whether they're practicing architects or historians that were trained as architects or art historians, that have engaged Mies uh, over the decades, right? And how do you explain this, you know, continuous flow of interests, like in ways that perhaps parallel with Le Corbusier, certainly with Frank Lloyd Wright, for which there's a book written a month, but so they seem to be still the kind of Mies, Le Corbusier, and Wright still seem to be generating great interest, whereas so there's dozens and dozens of architects that engaged the modern in very interesting ways that still don't seem to compete in the sheer number of articles and books that are being produced about Mies, say, for example. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think in some other conversation between us, you mentioned that there's so many tour groups going through through Falling Water or any other Wright House, and comparatively lower numbers of visitors make the trip out to the Farnsworth House. The same happens in Barcelona, where you have queues around the block to visit one of Gaudi's apartment buildings, but the Barcelona Pavilion by me sits there rather quietly and waits for visitors, right? So there is a directness of enjoyment and experience that you can get from Wright or from Gaudi, more so than from the minimalism of Mies, where you need to have a bit of a sort of equipment, a little knowledge of what it means, what he was after, and what minimalism can do for us. And it seems to be something that comes with a certain level of education and economic standing. It's really quite interesting if you think of Pierre Bourdieu's book about distinction, where he is a French sociologist who wrote a wonderful book where he interviewed thousands of people about their taste in art and music and food and so on. And he could make real sort of statistic predictions of how, in fact, the love for the abstraction of modern art, Mondrian and so on, or Mies in our case, right, would be something that is typical for a particular and somewhat small slice of the population. People who embrace Mies usually are the ones with, university education, et cetera, et cetera. So we are determined by our standing and upbringing and education to embrace certain pieces of art and architecture. And I think that is one thing to consider, that we are sort of conditioned to embrace that. On the other hand, one could argue that Mies's minimalism seemed to have been a good response for the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and also maybe the giddiness of the post-war boom here in the United States. So it was seen as a calm equivalent to the exciting times. But it's important to remember that it was only embraced by a small part of the population, right? So it's a really interesting thing that I think deserves more scrutiny and thinking about.
Right. And to your point about the kind of understanding, you write convincingly about Mies and discovering structural poetry as opposed to simply structural honesty. So that's you constantly, for folks that are aware of the literature about Mies, they can see your subtle shifts in your own engagement with what others have written. So back to structural poetry, and you mentioned also us, quoting your words, magic trick of plug wells, right? So have other scholars, discussed this in the same context that you have, especially, since many have referenced Mies's pursuit of almost nothing, right? Have they offered plug welds as evidence of this, or have they just remained in vague sort of illusions?
No, that's a good point. I was actually astonished when I suddenly realized that I had no idea how the Farnsworth house held together, right? Because you couldn't see the screws, you couldn't see the welding seams. And then I started looking, and I found only a sort of brief reference in Franz Schulze's famous biography of Mies of 1986 to plug welds. And one other article, forget the author right now, but it was very little mentioned. And I then called up Guy Nordenson in New York as an engineer, and he suggested that plug welds were really the only way of doing it the way Mies did it. So it hasn't really been theorized much or enough. And for me, it's really interesting, almost a key element of this building, Mies's artistic intervention at the locus of an important sort of structural point, that he makes a structured detail, the focus of his artistic endeavor. I think that is really an important thing happening there. And yes, it looks almost magical. And once one knows about it, you can't really unsee it. It's almost a little scary because just to add that we don't really know how well these connections work because each one was handcrafted. And, we don't know how good the welder was, how deeply those two pieces meeting at this point invisibly inside, how well they are connected. We have no idea, right? You can't really x-ray those
Right.
steel connections. So it's really an interesting precariousness. Maybe one day something will fracture there or so. But it's for me, it was a major discovery to see that, Mies in a sort of pure form, reducing this connection to something that made the actual truth of its holding together invisible. So,
And when you pointed out to the black and white photos where the plug welds are visible, but in the lower terrace, on the other hand, where the traditional bolts were present, I found that image very revealing because the lower terrace now is you cannot see those connections because the travertine has been placed. So the differences are, you assume that the plug welds have been used throughout, but in fact, these kind of contrasts between say a 19th century kind of mode of building and a kind of you referred to this almost in sublime terms, I think is very much kind of part of that. Well, how about we end then with one question? You mentioned about Elizabeth Gordon, who of course was pro-Wrightian. She celebrated Wright's work. She was also a Midwesterner, and she went to school at the University of Chicago. So she would have had direct access to much of Wright, his early home and studio, and a series of houses, including Roby. And so there's part of some of the gossip mill, right, about Mies's sort of being a difficult architect, or the opposite, that Edith was a difficult client, where we know that inevitably it's always a little bit of both, trying to figure out. So how do you, in a way, explain during, we published, and I'm very proud of that, the 3 chapters of Edith's memoirs, although Alice Friedman had used these memoirs back to her pioneering book on women in modern architecture in the late 90s, they had never been published in there extensively. So this is now part of the book. And here you hear Edith explain that on the one hand, Mies was not interested in having operable hopper windows, and that was, also a problem. And also there was a kind of friction over the screen that was present in the MoMA model, but that subsequently there was some tug of war over whether it should be actually installed. So I wonder if you can speak to the client/patron and architect relation as it kind of surfaces in these details about use.
Yeah, I must say, I'm very impressed with Edith Farnsworth's writing and her role as a very, very generous client. You know, obviously she bankrolled all of those experiments that Mies was interested in, and so I found her sort of intelligent and insightful in her diaries, and clearly what she identified, and which I think is, you know, the point I already made, is that Mies was interested in the appearance of the house. And I think Elizabeth Gordon was absolutely right when she pointed that out. The appearance of the house, the photogeneity, that's why the hopper windows were sort of disturbing that, or the screen didn't look as good. He was much less interested in the way the house functioned. He just didn't get that much attention. It was all about image, visuality, appearance in magazines and so on. So I think it's a very important point to make, that this house was a work of art, a beautiful abstract sculpture, and preceding, you know, the white sculptures of Solowit by a few decades and so on. You know, so it's really an interesting piece. But as a house, it had a good number of shortcomings that were only rectified when Lord Palumbo put in air conditioning and a few other things, and better glass has recently been put in, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very important point to make, that Mies was really an artist architect, and she was a great supportive client, paid dearly for it. As you might know, you know, the hours that he charged her, that he had worked on the house in those many years that it took from 45 of its design to its completion, 51, were twice as many working hours as were built for the 2 towers of the Lakeshore Drive apartments. So she paid dearly for her generosity of supporting this artistic intervention. And so I have great respect for her role as a client of making this particular building possible. And her diaries are a joy to read. Really, I'm glad they're in your book. I think we had talked about it early on. I thought there was a necessary thing to do. One should probably publish the whole thing at some point. It's really quite an amazing document.
Well, Dietrich, thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights, and of course, congratulations on your hefty volume that sort of adds to the growing body of Mies literature. And I hope that we can soon reunite in Chicago and toast to Mies on the lower terrace of the Farnsworth House. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see a few familiar names and also faces. I'm here, and maybe I'll just jump in, right? Is that the best and the best thing to do, or did you want to say anything?
No, let's jump right in. I guess I'll start with a question for myself. If you all have questions, please put them in the chat as we're talking. But you mentioned how obviously you have written a work about Mies. You've worked with Dr. Sabatino. What brings you personally back to Mies van der Rohe over and over again?
Well, that is, a very, very good question and a little hard to answer. I've always, that has been going on for a long time. In my case, I've written a number of essays and then finally got to write the book. Maybe I'll quickly hold it up here. Just came. Oh, you can't really see it because of the blurred background. Anyway, it's a fairly substantial book that came out, and I feel I'm probably done now for a while with Mies, but I wonder if it had to do with the fact that he was, both German and then American, like myself. I came here 35 years ago at a sort of similar juncture as Mies, but I think I've always been fascinated both by the sort of radicalism of this man who dressed like a bourgeois in expensive suits and smoked Havana Monte Cristo cigars, but was a real radical and quite ruthless in many ways as he pursued the goals of his aesthetic vision, right? So I think that has always fascinated me. And then as you get into these things, I think you find that the archival evidence is maybe a little different, as I just tried to point out in my conversation with Michelangelo. Archival evidence and sort of close observation sometimes reveal things being a little different than in the existing scholarship. So that's always a good incentive to keep working and publish things that are maybe a little against the grain, I hope.
Absolutely. I also, if you all want to unmute and ask a question, you're perfectly welcome to do that as well. We just got a question in the chat. Why do we think that Mies continued to disregard the livability of his spaces? Was he not interested in providing a more livable interior to these structures? Surely this task, if uninteresting, could have been handled by his staff. It's a great question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I truly think he wasn't all that interested in the livability. That's even already evident in his early work. If you look at the Tugendhat the staff rooms are kind of small, and there's all kinds of problems with the way the functions work. When you walk into, some of you might have made the pilgrimage all the way to Brno, but you might, in either event, you might know that when you walk in on the entrance level, you're actually in the semi-private room of the bedrooms, and then you go down into the more semi-public room of the big living room where guests would go. So there are functional overlaps that aren't very well solved, and I think he didn't have enough interest in them to direct his staff to work these things out. So I think he was really interested in and devoted to an aesthetic vision, which then ended up, of course, as we all know, influencing the way we think about apartment interiors and the way we live, and a certain minimalism that has been a constant strand in 20th century and 21st century architecture afterwards. But initially, I think his drive was not towards providing comfortable sheltering environments. It was something else. It was really an almost sort of abstract search for the ultimate beautiful reductive essentialist form. That was something that really fascinated me.
And to the second part of the question, do we think his staff just thought he knew better and didn't think they should get involved when it came to his clients? Or
I think sometimes those solutions to questions of comfort, etc., might have compromised his aesthetic vision, and I don't think he would have allowed that. So, we talked to Michelangelo brought up the hopper windows, or something that would have divided up the big glass walls to let in additional air, which was dearly needed to even make the fireplace work, etc., etc. He didn't like that because the idea was to reduce a window, or basically eliminate the window and just have either, walls, or just reduce a building, in this case, to a ceiling and a floor plate and the supports in between, and the rest is just glass walls. So they're neither walls nor windows. There's something, it's just a sort of screen that surrounds it. So as a vision, of course, absolutely fascinating. But I don't think he was interested in making compromises to his aesthetic vision.
surely his relationship with Dr. Farnsworth confirms that, if nothing else. Another question has come in. With respect to solar gain, did Mies not site the house south of a very large tree to provide shading, as the tree is no longer there? This is actually a good question. Was basically, is the tree the factor in with the sun, I guess?
Yeah, that's true. There was that tree, but I don't think it ever was sufficient enough in its shading capabilities, but that was maybe a little bit of an excuse. He didn't want those huge blinds that I showed you in the Tugendhat house, because they would have marred some of the proportional outline of the facade and wouldn't have looked great when they came out in the summer. So he came up with the idea of that tree, but I think he might have been aware of the fact that it would have been insufficient. And of course, there are periods in Chicago where you don't have leaves on the tree anymore, and the sun is still quite hot, as we all know. And so the sun, of course, also moves beyond the shade of the shade of the tree is a moving entity, right? So it's a good explanation, but I think it's one of those things where Mies said, there are good explanations, and then there's the real reason. I think it was a good explanation, but the real reason were that the aesthetics were most important to him, and that's why he didn't put in a sunscreen.
Absolutely. Our next question, other than the initial visit when the house was completed, did Philip Johnson ever visit the Farnsworth house again that you know of?
Unfortunately, I don't know if he ever came back. Yes, a good question. I don't know. Mrs. Farnsworth, to her credit, was very open to receiving visitors. Mies didn't go when she was there, but he sent people there, and they were always let in and could tour the building. She was all in all a very good person, I think, and played along. And despite having suffered through the court case and a huge financial loss and not being very comfortable on her weekends there, she was still very gracious in terms of letting people see it and welcoming them, etc.
That makes sense. The next question that's come in, could you speak to Edith's intent for her retreat to be a place for her and visitors, yet Mies gives her a home with one bedroom and no true partitions between living spaces? Was this a concession by Edith or something else she actively agreed with?
I think as long as the house was still on paper, which of course was a long time, almost 5 years, right? So they start talking in 45 and immediately have that design basically ready, and then they play around with details. Mies had at first thought they could involve some students from IIT and build something really simple with concrete, etc. He hadn't worked out those specific details yet, but I think she was there throughout that design process, and she enjoyed coming to the office and looking at models and so on. So I think at some point she must have agreed that this minimalist vision of just a single room where everything is sort of connected was a very appealing artistic vision. I would assume that she agreed to that, Yeah.
Gotcha. Circling back to the practicality portion, you mentioned how the fireplace actually wasn't that functional, but the floor was heated from the onset. Was that kind of a concession to the fact that he knew the fireplace was going to be a bit finicky, or is that just a natural thing that if you're going to have stone floors in the middle of a 60-acre property, that heated floors would be a necessity?
That's an excellent question, and I must admit that I don't know the answer to it.
Fair enough.
I hope Scott maybe could chime in if he knows anything on. I would have to research that. I apologize.
No.
Excellent question. Yeah.
We love it when we're installing in the winter that the floors are heated, certainly.
Right.
So I always think of the heated flooring. So I was wondering if there was any, since the fireplace was not exactly the most practical use, if that was kind of the concession he made.
Yeah.
But it's good thing to know. Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, if we don't, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us as well. And don't forget to look into our next webinars. And many of the books mentioned in this lecture are available in our gift shop. So if you want to further support the Farnsworth House, we highly suggest you go to our gift shop and look at those books. Professor, thank you so much again. And everyone, have a great Sunday.
Thank you. It really was a pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah. Bye-bye.